Welcome to Chapter 8, Social-Emotional Development in Middle and Late Childhood. Once again, this is the age range 6 to 11, or what we call the elementary school years. I will be covering 3 sections in this chapter with 3 videos. The first will be emotional and personality development. Then I will be skipping the family section and asking you to learn that on your own. I will be covering peers and also schools. So let's begin with emotional and personality development, and we will talk about the self, emotional development, moral development, and I will also be leaving gender for you to read on your own. So let's begin with the self and the development of self-understanding during middle and late childhood. As it says here, from 8 to 11, children describe themselves in terms of psychological characteristics and traits. You certainly would not see this in earlier years or earlier time periods. Younger children, such as preschoolers, would describe themselves according to what they own, how they look, and some basic characteristics about themselves, but nothing that we would call psychological or personality traits. They might say, my name's Jimmy, I'm 5 years old, I own a truck, I have a cat, I have blonde hair, I like to run, I can climb well, etc. Whereas now with 8 to 11-year-olds, we're hearing terms like popular or nice or helpful or perhaps even mean or smart or dumb when they do self-descriptions. So they're looking more inwards and understanding personality characteristics and psychological characteristics that could describe themselves. Children recognize social characteristics of the self as well when they do self-descriptions. In these elementary school years, they tend to include more social groups than in earlier times. So they might mention if they're a Girl Scout or a Catholic, or that they have 2 good friends or things like that. Talking about themselves in relation to others, or even things such as a nationality. I am Canadian. Self-description increasingly involves social comparison, and this social comparison is now more likely because children are capable of perspective taking, and we'll see about that. We see that coming up in the bottom section. In order to do social comparisons, you do have to, kind of take the perspective of comparing yourself versus others, and in a sense, having some understanding of another's skills or their characteristics. Also, in order to do social comparisons, you need to be able to hold enough items in your short-term working memory. And it does take a certain amount of a memory capacity, or let's say short-term memory capacity, in order to perform a social comparison. You have to think about yourself and your skills or your traits, and another or others and their skills and traits, and then you have to perform the comparison. It's actually a little bit beyond what younger children can do. This is why preschoolers tend to think that they are great at everything, is because they're not good at comparing their skills to others. In elementary school, we kind of come crashing down to earth and realize, wait a sec, I'm not the fastest runner in the world, or the smartest kid in the world, or I can't jump the highest of anyone. Okay. Understanding others does involve perspective taking. And this certainly improves during the elementary school years. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Children become more skeptical of others' claims, and this be, this becoming less trusting of others increases with age. So let's say, for instance, an 8-year-old states that I am smart. Well, a 5 or 6-year-old would probably just accept that statement as true. Oh, he must be smart. Whereas, like a 9 or 10-year-old would be much more likely to reject that claim. So, younger children just accept what's given to them and accept the claims of others. Older children are much less likely to do so and are more skeptical. Okay. Self-esteem and self-concept are important skills. We can define them in this case as, and this is not true of everyone's definition of these terms in psychology, but at least our particular author, defines self-esteem as a global evaluation of the self. So how am I overall as a person? How do I feel about myself? It's also known as self-worth or self-image. Your self-concept includes domain-specific evaluations of the self. So how am I academically? How am I athletically? What do I think about my appearance, etc. So it's individual areas where you have a evaluation of yourself. And once again, the self-esteem is kind of like, in a sense, you're combining all of your self-concepts into one whole rating or evaluation of the self. Okay. Children with high self-esteem may not necessarily do better in school. Inflated self-esteem, as it says here, can distort ability. If self-esteem has not really been earned, but has just been granted a child when they haven't done anything to deserve it, their self-esteem will tend to be inflated, and it can really cause this student or child to really kind of come crashing down to earth when they reach higher levels of schooling and competition becomes more fierce and they realize that they just are not as good as they thought they were at certain skills. When self-esteem is earned, it is helpful to an individual, to a child or an adolescent. But when it is just um, handed to them without them with, and it's not based upon their accomplishments, it can have negative effects in the long run. Okay. Those with higher self-esteem tend to have greater initiative. It can be positive or negative. Gang lead, like just because you have self-esteem, I mean, a gang leader could have high self-esteem, which makes them the leader of the gang. So, I mean, you can turn high self-esteem to the dark side. You can turn it in positive or negative ways. Children with low self-esteem, as it says here, linked to obesity, anxiety, depression, suicide, delinquency, a whole host of negatives. One study found that youth that had low self-esteem had lower life satisfaction at the age of 30. So this is a longitudinal study, and they looked at their self-esteem in late childhood and early adolescence, and found that when they reached the age of 30, that it did affect their overall life satisfaction. So it doesn't just go away on its own. It's not like, well, I'm got low self-esteem now, I just as easily may have higher self-esteem later. I mean, it tends to be somewhat consistent, and children and adolescents with lower self-esteem kind of carry that negativity into adulthood, and it can affect their contentment with life. Their low self-esteem can either be accurate or a distorted self-perception. So, in the case of it being accurate, it may be an accurate perception of their shortcomings. some children or adolescents, do know that they're just not very good at certain things, um, which can cause them to have lower self-esteem. So it may be an earned, in a sense, low self-esteem. I mean, I hate to say that, but for many children with low self-esteem, it's actually a distortion, and they have some sort of inferiority complex that's been built up in childhood, where they devalue their their skills and traits and accomplishments, and this would most times come from harsh and critical parents, where the child is never good enough at anything they accomplish. So this child may be getting a C average in school, but as far as the parents are concerned, they talk to the child as if they're failing. Whereas in another household, parents may be content that their child has a C average, and that child would feel better about their C. So sometimes it's a distortion where a child has just learned that nothing they do is good enough, and so they develop the inferiority complex. Self-efficacy is certainly a term that's related to it's related to confidence. It's also related to self-esteem. The definition here is a belief that one can master a situation and produce favorable outcomes. It's the belief that I can do something rather than I cannot. So it's certainly related to confidence, but it's kind of a belief that even if I don't know, even if I can't directly see the path ahead of me, I know I can overcome obstacles. So, for instance, if I may have a feeling that, okay, I want to become a nurse or a doctor, and I'm going to go take the right classes and get the right degrees, and I may not see all the steps, and I may not know. I may know that there may be hardships and obstacles along the way, but sometimes if you have a feeling that you just know you're going to overcome and get there, if you want it bad enough, then that's high self-efficacy. Confidence we tend to talk about in more specific terms, like I'm confident in my mathematical ability, or I'm confident in being able to do this one thing. But self-efficacy is more of a long-term feeling of knowing that you can persevere and that you have the skills to overcome unforeseen obstacles along the way. Okay, students that have low self-efficacy, that have low self-efficacy for learning, they may avoid many learning tasks, especially more challenging tasks. So if a student has that belief that I just cannot do certain things, I cannot do math, or I just can't write properly. I mean, they will purposely try to avoid these tasks, which will just tend to exacerbate their weakness in that area. If you're not good at math to begin with, and you believe that you cannot do it, and so you avoid mathematical challenges, you're not going to improve your skill, and it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a lower self-efficacy can be very harmful. It's going to affect decisions, and it will affect your learning. Okay. I'm just going to skip the self-regulation a little bit there and get to Erikson's fourth stage, industry versus inferiority. So once again, I always like to review. The first stage was trust versus mistrust in the first year of life. Second stage was autonomy versus shame and doubt. That was from 1 to 3 years of age. And then it was initiative and versus guilt. And the initiative was from 3 to 5 years of age. This fourth stage, industry versus inferiority, goes from approximately 6 to 11. And industry just is basically like a feeling of competence. when you feel industrious, you feel like you can do things, you can make things or do things or build things, and so it's like a feeling of confidence, you know, whereas the opposite, the inferiority, is a feeling of not being able to do anything successfully. So it's, do you have a feeling of confidence? Do you feel like you can do things? And so once again, this is related to self-efficacy. This fourth stage of Erickson's. You believe that you have skills that you can use to accomplish things, to master things. Uh, so it is considered a oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading my wrong notes here. Okay, actually, I think that's all I want to say about it. So, sense of industry, sense of being able to accomplish things, build things, be competent, and the reason, of course, that comes now during these elementary school years is once again these are the years you start social comparison. So as you compare yourself to others, you learn what you're good at and what you're not, and this is where the sense of industry comes from. Or if you find out that you're not very good at anything, you get that inferiority. Okay, so there's a section now on emotional development. And what I'm asking you to do is to read this section on your own. It's on pages 230 to 232. There is a test item from this section, but I'm actually not going to cover the emotional development section. I only have 2 slides on it. On a part of this section have to do with stress and trauma, which sometimes I cover, but I'm actually going to skip it. So read those few pages on your own for sure, all about emotional development, including the section on stress and trauma. And I'm going to continue with moral development. And the primary theory in moral development comes from Kohlberg. A couple of chapters ago, we looked at morality and talked a little bit about Piaget's stages. Remember, he had heteronymous morality and autonomous morality. He talked about a couple of stages with a transition stage in between. And we talked, briefly about how Freud believed that feelings were important for morality. But those, and the behaviors talked a little bit about morality, but they were all like just kind of small, partial, what I think of it as partial theories. They were just parts of other theories, or they weren't large scale theories. Kohlberg is really the name when it comes to having a major morality theory. He did research with his initial research, at least, was in Chicago with boys between the ages of 8 up to about 19, and he interviewed these boys for hours at a time. I think on average, I think he spent about 2 hours with each subject, asking them a series of questions, or he would present them with a scenario and then ask them questions about it, to get at their morality reasoning. Anyway, so this is once again, this is kind of considered the primary theory of morality, moral development, and in it, Kohlberg outlines 6 stages. 6 stages that occur within 3 major levels. So each level has 2 individual stages. And for our purposes, I am only going to talk about the 3 major levels. You can read about the individual stages and what happens within each level, the shift that goes on. But I really just want to concentrate on the 3 major levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional reasoning. In this first level of pre-conventional reasoning, this is certainly representative of childhood morality. Children interpret good and bad in terms of external rewards and punishments. So something bad is something that they get punished for. Something good is something that they get rewarded for. So there's no real internalization at this stage as far as morality goes. The children do not have an internal sense of right or wrong or consciences or a conscience. They basically are acting according to the rules that are coming from outside of themselves. So they learn, don't do this or I get punished. Don't do this or I get punished. So it's not about that those actions are bad or that they're harmful. It's just that they lead to punishment. So their morality is controlled externally. They have no internalization. Okay. And that's pre-conventional reasoning. It's all based on rewards and punishments. The second major level is conventional reasoning. This is where most of you would be at now, and or most of us, I should say, uh, because most of society ends up at level two reasoning. Um, it describes most adolescents and adults. In conventional reasoning, individuals apply certain standards of morality, but the standards are set by others. But I mean, the individual internalizes those standards. So they don't make up the standards themselves; they accept them from others and internalize them. So you, in this stage, level two conventional reasoning, you learn that the stealing is wrong and that there's a law against it, and you internalize it, and you come to believe that it is wrong to steal. Now, you didn't create that law stealing is wrong, or that idea that stealing is wrong. You heard it from others, and then you accepted it. This is what defines level two. And this is once again, this is where most of society, adolescents and adults, would be. Um, and it's kind of, we consider it a mid-level internalization. You're not generating the rules on your own; you're accepting them from others, but you do internalize them and come to believe in them. Certainly, level two includes following rules, following laws um, that are set by parents, by rules that are set by parents, laws that are set by governments, the norms of society. Okay. Uh, for those that make it to level three, post-conventional reasoning, and this is probably approximately 10% of of those in society might progress to level three. In post-conventional reasoning, an individual recognizes alternative moral courses. They explore their options, between the different choices available, and then they decide on a personal moral code. Um, it they make it their own. So in level three, you don't just follow particular laws because they are your state laws or your country's laws. You recognize that the laws are different in some areas versus others. And so you weigh the different laws and see which one makes sense to yourself. So you're not just accepting, but you're analyzing. And you may combine different laws and say, my position is somewhere in between. So, as an example, I mean, uh, it's at the one point there's laws in some states that gay people can marry, and laws in other states that they cannot. Well, do you just follow the state that you're in and what their laws are? Well, that's what most people in level two would do. But in level three, you think, okay, well, the laws can be either or. There's different possibilities here. Let me think about the issue and weigh it and come up with my own personal idea of right and wrong. The same as now there are states that have that allow marijuana sales and marijuana smoking. In other states, it's still illegal. And so, if you're in level two, once again, you tend to just accept whatever your particular country or your particular state's laws are, In level 3, you really kind of try to come up with what you believe at a personal level should be the law. And sometimes it will be completely different from what the laws actually are. Um, Not only should you be able to think in this way to be at level 3, but you need to live according to the your personal moral code that you generate. I mean, when we look at historical examples, they often point to somebody like Gandhi. He developed a moral code, and he lived by it even when it caused him personal harm. And if you're at level 3, you're supposed to be willing to risk, your own liberty. For instance, you may have to go to jail to defend what you believe, but you stick by your principles when you're at level 3 reasoning, and you don't just cave because something's against the law. You follow your beliefs above anything else. So it's full internalization of of a moral code. An example might be something like all human beings should have equal rights. That might be one code that you live by. That all human beings should have equal rights, and so it applies to many different situations, but it's an overall guiding code that you live by. Okay, those are the 3 major levels. Make sure you understand the differences. Level 1, 2, and 3. Continuing with Kohlberg's theory, I want to talk about a few influences on that he mentions, as contributing to what level a child or an adolescent might be at, or an adult even. One is certainly cognitive development. As your overall cognition improves, it makes it more likely that you will move up a stage or move up a level. If we have more logical abilities, obviously, we can progress to a higher level of morality. So, especially when we go back and look at post conventional reasoning, you really need some high level cognitive skills to be at the reasoning ability uh, to really internalize rights and wrongs and the personal code of conduct. A child cannot do that. They don't find adolescents, for instance, at level 3. They find some adults. Once again, maybe up to 10%. Hey, experiences dealing with moral questions and moral conflicts promotes, uh, you know, going to a higher stage or level. So he talks about, if you're in a family, for instance, that talks about moral issues and moral conflicts during your childhood or your adolescence, it will progress you through the levels quicker. And finally, peer interaction and perspective taking. Like Piaget, Kohlberg believed that peers were more important than parents to advance moral reasoning because parents often hand down rules in an authoritarian manner. They just, they give the child, this is right, this is wrong. They give them the rules. But when you're with your peers, it allows for negotiation and reasoning about rules. You can argue this should be the rule, and somebody else might argue no, this should be the rule, and this is right, no, this is right. I mean, like, so you argue and you discuss with your peers, and you learn more about morality by doing this. You don't really argue and discuss with your parents. So he believed that peer interaction and perspective taking were 2 very important contributors to moral development. There were also a number of critics of Kohlberg's work. I'm going to go through some of these. First of all, moral thought and behavior. There are critics that say that he emphasized thinking about morality. He gave scenarios for his subjects to think about, and he would ask them a series of questions about, would you do this? Would you do that? Like, what's the right thing to do in the scenario? So he was never actually testing behavior. He was testing how people thought about morality. And so people make the point that moral reasoning can sometimes be a shelter for actual immoral behavior. So you may have what's considered moral reasoning. I think this way about morality, but you may actually behave in a negative, immoral way. So, for instance, how many times have we heard about a politician that endorses family values and the sanctity of marriage, and then we find them having an affair with somebody while they were married, and so they espouse like high ideals of morality, but and so it seems like they're reasoning at a high level, but their actual behavior is counter to what their reasoning is. So the moral reasoning acts as a shelter for their moral. It kind of covers up their immoral behavior. And the people that make this point say, this has happened throughout our history. That and many people, such as Bandura, he's the one that came up with social cognitive theory. Just to remind you, he makes a statement that he believes no one ever does immoral acts without actually believing in the morality of their actions. So he would make the point that Hitler believed he was being moral in all of his actions, with everything he did with with the with killing off of the millions of people and whatnot. That he believed he was doing something moral, and so experts have made the point that we hide our most negative actions behind the cloak of morality, and that religions have been doing this throughout the ages, as well as many dictators and world leaders. Okay, so this basic criticism is that they don't really match up. How we reason about morality, how we talk about it, is not the same many times as how we behave. Okay, I'm going to skip the second point, go down to culture and moral reasoning. Um, People make the point that his theory is culturally biased in certain ways. What we find in cross-cultural research is that the first two levels tend to hold up pretty well in other cultures. So the pre-conventional and the conventional levels, we kind of see that they both tend to exist in the majority of cultures. But when you get to the post-conventional level, it can vary from one culture to another. And this has to do with the comparison of individualistic versus collectivist societies. We are an individualistic society. Our highest order of morality is about things like the rights of the individual, and that everyone has a right to freedom and to happiness, and it's really about you know it really is centered around the rights of the individual. Whereas in a collectivist culture, it is about the good of the group and what's best for the community, what's best for the group as a whole. And so your moral decisions on the highest levels would turn out to be different in each society. Um, as an example, I mean, in our society, we would say, well, it wouldn't be right to sacrifice a child just so that two other children would live. I mean, you can't make that decision. You can't decide to put one child to death if it meant two others would live. But in a collectivist society, you might be more inclined to think that way. For the good of the group, this one child should die. It would provide life for two others. I mean, that may sound a little harsh, and it may not be exactly accurate, but it's along those ideas that you find differences, you know, and in the highest level. Okay, let me go on here. I'm going to skip this slide completely. You guys can read about these criticisms on your own. There's one other kind of famous criticism I want to talk about, and it's the gender and care perspective idea. And this comes from a researcher named Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan. And she actually worked with Kohlberg. I believe she was a graduate student when he was doing his research. And um, she took exception to the fact that his original research was with all males. As I mentioned earlier, he had boys in Chicago in his initial studies. So he researched males, and he's a male. And Carol Gilligan decided that what he came up with was a theory of morality for males, and that it did not apply equally to females. Carol Gilligan made the point that there are two different types of moral perspectives. One she called the justice perspective. It focuses on the rights of the individual and on which individuals independently make moral decisions. And she says this is what his theory concentrates on, the justice perspective. This is, this is right by law. This is what a jury would say is right or wrong. I mean, so it's kind of like, think of it's kind of like you're a judge and jury and you're making decisions about right or wrong based on that. She presented the idea that females tend to use a care perspective more, which views people in terms of connectedness with others, emphasizes interpersonal communication, relationships with others, concern for others. It's almost a little bit more like the collectivist society idea I was talking about earlier, that what is moral is what is good for people. It's good for individuals. So these two different perspectives may come up with different answers in different scenarios. Anyways, so she did push this point, and I want to mention it because there was a lot of literature that was written concerning the justice versus the care perspective. She did a lot of research. There was some back and forth in publications. So it did make a real splash and was kind of argued and researched and tested over a number of years. The end result, I will say, was that the majority of the research supported the idea that Kohlberg's theory applied equally to both males and females, and that both males and females have the ability to use justice perspectives and care perspectives, and that it's not split by sex. That, males know how to use a care perspective, and they do at times. Females know how to use a justice perspective, and they do at times. So the research showed it's not as split as nicely as she may have originally presented, and that Kohlberg's theory was applicable to both genders or both sexes. Okay, and that is it for moral development. There is a section on gender. I've decided to skip this whole section and leave it for you people to read. It talks about differences that exist between the genders as far as physical, cognitive, and social emotional development. You can find out what males and females are better than each other at, and what real differences exist. I think it's a good section to read, an interesting section. I do want you to do it on your own. So please make sure you do read and study that. And that will end the first section of chapter 8. I'm going to point out before I leave that this section on families, I already had 3 crossed out. I'm actually skipping the whole section. So there's just 2 slides here, and you can skip over these 2 slides. And once again, I'm encouraging you to read the textbook on your own for this section. When I come back in the next video, we will talk about peers.